Can the Falcons overcome the loss of two notable defensive assistant coaches? And are they doing their part to solve the NFL's problem with a lack of minority head coaches?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the number one sports podcast network in all of the galaxy. And if you don't know me, I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Sirius Black. I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong here on Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And on today's daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, we are talking about coaching losses, coaching additions, right? We'll be talking about how big a blow is losing defensive coaches like Jerry Gray and Mike Rutenberg to other teams in the last 24 hours. We'll talk about the addition of a assistant quarterbacks coach that is a minority and whether or not that's helping the problem that the NFL has with, a lack of available minority head coaches. So we'll start off talking about the loss of those two prominent defensive coaches. We know Jeff Ulbrich has done his best to try to maintain continuity on that defensive coaching staff with the hiring of Kevin Stefanski during the cycle, as we've discussed before, where the Falcons have basically been able to maintain about 60% of their main assistants on that side of the ball, but two that they did not able to maintain, or two of the biggest, are Mike Rutenberg, their Falcons' former defensive passing game coordinator. He will now be heading to Cleveland to become their new defensive coordinator, taking over for Jim Schwartz under Todd Monken's new Brown staff. And then Jerry Gray, who was, I forget what his official title was, assistant head coach of the defense or assistant coach of the defense. He will now be rejoining Raheem Morris in San Francisco, and an as of yet to be named in terms of his official title there, but I'm sure we'll do similar things helping out Raheem there on the defensive side of the ball. And as I said, these are two significant blows to the Falcons defensive coaching staff. Rutenberg, aka Rudy, joined Jeff Ulbrich here in Atlanta this past year, along with Nate Ollie, and was sort of kind of that trifecta of those Jets coaches that really contributed in a major way to improving this Falcons defense. We noted throughout the year that the Falcons pass defense was the strength. Obviously, a lot of credit goes to the pass rush, facilitated in part by Nate Ollie as the defensive line coach, but that was the purview of Mike Rutenberg, right? As the defensive passing game coordinator, like a reflection of how good this pass defense was is a reflection of how good a job that Rudy did this past year. And now he gets to take his talents up north to Cleveland, switching places with Kevin Stefanski. Should be a good fit to replace Jim Schwartz and build off of the success that Schwartz has had over the last couple of years, coaching one of the better defenses in the NFL during that time, right? They both are going to likely maintain that wide 9 scheme that Jim Schwartz runs. That's what the Falcons do. And Rudy has done that, learning that under Jeff Ulbrich and Robert Saleh over the years. Now with Jerry Gray, he joined the Falcons in 23 alongside then defensive coordinator Ryan Nielsen. He was one of the hires that Arthur Smith made in what would prove to be his final year in Atlanta. And we saw, especially that 23 season, with the improvement the defense made then before the regression that we saw under a undisclosed, I just can't remember who the defensive coordinator was in 2024 with that regression. But, we saw the improvement of the defense in 23. And a lot of that, particularly in the first half of the season, was spearheaded by how well that secondary was playing in the front half of that season. And obviously Jerry Gray was retained under Raheem Morris and will continue to work alongside Raheem Morris in San Francisco. And, we talked about this before the podcast, because Jerry Gray and Kevin Stefanski worked together for many years in Minnesota. We thought, it was a shoo-in for Jerry Gray to be retained by Kevin Stefanski, but obviously Jerry Gray had different plans. And I guess we'll probably never know whether or not that was facilitated by the Falcons end or from Gray's end, but I would imagine Jerry Gray has been around long enough where, he can make his own bed at this point in time. So I think this is the loss of two high-value defensive assistants. We talk about the quote-unquote brain trust on that side of the ball. I think Rudy and Gray represent like 50% of that brain trust. alongside guys like Jeff Ulbrich and Nate Ollie. And it's not to sit here and say that the rest of the Falcons defensive coaching staff is trash or worthless or anything like that. But it would be no different than we talk about the offense, where we look at the offensive line coach, whether we're talking about Bill Callahan or Dwayne Ledford formerly, or we look at, Tommy Reese as the OC and Tanner Ingstrom as the passing game coordinator and Alex Van Pelt as the quarterback's coach, right? These are kind of the pillars of the offensive brain trust on that side of the ball. And if you were to lose any of those guys, you would be like, okay, that's not something that's easily replaced. And so I think the Falcons will have their work cut out for them to replace people like Gray, who's been a NFL assistant for nearly 30 years, following almost a decade of playing football in the NFL at a high level. I think it was a 4-time Pro Bowler, during his playing career in the late 80s and early 90s. And then Rudy was labeled as an up-and-comer these last couple of years. And so it was probably a matter of time before he got an opportunity. But he's going to get that opportunity in Cleveland, and we'll see what he does. So it's not to say anything devastating about the Falcons defense, like, oh, they're destined to be a bottom 10 defense, but it's like no different than us talking about replacing a starter, in terms of the actual players on the field, right? And frankly, it's probably a lot easier to replace a player than it is to a quality player like a starter would be versus a coach like either Rudy or Gray would be considered, because we know that hundreds of players enter the NFL that are qualified to enter the NFL on an annual basis, and we probably just don't have that type of pipeline and pool of up and coming coaching talent constantly entering the NFL, where it's like, oh well, you can just easily replace Jerry Gray's 30 years because there's another, there's 1,700 assistants that are got 30 years of NFL coaching experience. So I think it will be a challenge for the Falcons, but we'll see how they answer that challenge. But speaking of pipelines, I've seen a lot made in recent weeks about now that the NFL head coaching cycle is over following the Super Bowl, that we have 10 new head coaches in the NFL this year, and none of them are black. And I think it's notable that the Falcons just hired an assistant quarterbacks coach in Jordan Reid, who is black. And are they kind of doing their part to give some young black coaches like a Jordan Reid the opportunities to potentially become future NFL head coaches down the road? And we'll break that down next as we continue today's Locked On Falcons.
Hey, it's Matt Derry from the Locked On Lions podcast. The people I love depend on me. If I'm gone, the financial responsibilities don't disappear. I didn't want my family figuring things out during the hardest moment of their lives. That's why I knew only one place to go. I chose life insurance through my friends at Ethos. Ethos makes getting life insurance fast and easy, 100% online. You can get a quote in seconds, apply in minutes, and get same-day coverage. There's no medical exam. You just answer a few simple health questions. You can get up to $3 million in coverage. Some policies are as low as $30 a month. I love the folks at Ethos. Protect your family with life insurance from Ethos now by going to ethos.com/LockedOnNFL. In as little as 10 minutes, you can get the free quote and up to $3 million in coverage at ethos.com/LockedOnNFL. That is ethos.com/LockedOnNFL. Ethos.com/LockedOnNFL. Application times and rates may vary.
Today's episode is also sponsored by Indeed Sponsored Jobs. We know the pressure is high in the NFL, and so it's high in your workplace, whether it's deadlines, overflowing inboxes, or that one position that you have to fill that's sitting open. When the pressure is on, you need the right hire, and Indeed is all you need. Indeed Sponsored Jobs is going to help you reach the right people who actually fit what you're looking for. You're looking for the right skills, experience, and location. So you're not just hoping the right candidate stumbles across your post. Over the next minute that I'm talking to you, companies like yours will be making 27 hires on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. So if you're hiring, spend less time searching and more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with Indeed Sponsored Jobs. You can get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job that premium placement it deserves at Indeed.com/podcast. Just go to Indeed.com/podcast right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions applied. Do you need a hire? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. So this is a subject that deserves more than 8 minutes of a podcast or whatever we're going to wind up spending talking about this. But to me, it's something that I thought about with the Falcons hiring assistant quarterbacks coach Jordan Reid recently. Reid has spent the last couple of years coaching wide receivers at the collegiate level, but now we'll get a chance to assist Alex Van Pelt, who is the Falcons quarterback coach, coaching the Falcons quarterbacks moving forward. Not unheard of for wide receivers coaches to make the switch, I think, prominently in the Falcons history, where their wide receiver coach in 2002, Mike Johnson, was switched to the quarterbacks coach in 2003, coached there for the next couple of years there under Jim Mora. And, to me, why this conversation is interesting, because it's part of the ongoing conversation with, the NFL's quote unquote problem with a lack of minority head coaches. As I mentioned at the top, we have 10 new head coaches, only one of whom is a minority in Robert Saleh, none of whom are black. We only have 3 current black head coaches in the NFL, D'Amico Ryans, Todd Bowles, and Aaron Glenn. And the last 2 are on the hot seat going into 2026. So there's a real world where, this time next year, we might only have 1 black head coach in the NFL. And even if someone like a Mike Tomlin returns in 2026, that underlines the point that there isn't a pipeline for new head coaches. We're just sort of rehashing the old coaches. And the Rooney Rule is one of the things that the NFL, has tried to institute. I think the Rooney Rule is a good idea. Again, is far from perfect, but nothing really is when it comes to things like this. But I think part of the reason why the pipeline is struggling is that we know typically NFL teams are hiring offensive coaches. Right. That's been in vogue for the last decade. And the majority of head coaches over the last decade have been offensive minded guys. And where do offensive minded head coaches come from? Typically, they are offensive coordinators prior to being head coaches. And where do offensive coordinators come from? They typically are quarterback coaches. And there's currently at least a half dozen minority quarterback coaches in the NFL currently. And so there is options in that pipeline. But one thing that stands out to me is a majority of the black quarterback coaches also coach black quarterbacks. Israel Wolfork in Baltimore, Gerard Johnson in Houston, DJ Williams in Washington, JT Barrett in Chicago. You could throw, Jordan Reid now as an assistant quarterbacks coach into that conversation, with Michael Penix being here and expected to be the Falcons starting quarterback for at least the majority of the 2026 season. And so it does feel like teams, I just find it interesting that teams seemed a little bit more willing to hire black quarterbacks coaches when they have black quarterbacks, but they're not the only ones. There are prominent ones that coach white quarterbacks and whatnot. But another prominent path to being an offensive coordinator, especially recently, and you kind of see this reflected in the Falcons' own coaching staff, is tight ends coach, right? We see that with Kevin Stefanski, was a tight ends coach before getting promoted. Tommy Rees was a tight ends coach when he first got to the NFL. Sean McVay famously was a tight ends coach before getting that promotion in Washington over a decade ago. Andy Reid was also a longtime tight ends coach in Green Bay before ultimately becoming a play calling head coach in the NFL. And you can obviously see the reason why tight ends coaches are seen as valuable, because the tight end position is the only position on offense that really has to kind of master both the passing game as well as the run game, right? And so it would obviously make sense to get someone who's coaching both aspects of it to be a coordinator and play caller in the NFL, because in theory they have a better mastery of both areas in both phases of the game, as opposed to just one that you would get from other position coaches. And obviously the Falcons have a black tight ends coach in Kevin Koger. He did interview for 2 offensive coordinator jobs, and I think was requested an interview for a 3rd one last year. The question is, was he getting those opportunities legitimately, or was it just for teams to kind of check the Rooney Rule compliance box and don't want to necessarily go down that rabbit hole of speculating? But let's give NFL teams the benefit of the doubt for the moment. But it does feel like a lot of these guys get to these spots where normally would be path for promotion in the pipeline to become offensive coordinators and then eventually head coaches for these minority assistants. But they don't move further down the pipe. They just get in the pipeline and then it gets stuck, right? You look at an example of David Blau, who was just recently named the new Washington Commanders offensive coordinator. He spent the last 2 years as an assistant quarterbacks coach, right? So he skipped a step, right, from going from assistant quarterbacks coach to quarterback to OC, right? And David Blau was in the league playing quarterback 3-4 years ago. And again, that may be part of the reason why he was fast-tracked, but he's not the first or last, quarterbacks coach to actually play in the league. And it's not to say he's not deserving or anything like that, but it does feel like, a lot of white coaches, not all, but a lot of white coaches have a tendency to more likely to get fast-tracked in these roles than necessarily their minority counterparts. And you look at 2 out of the last 3 MVPs, quarterbacks coached by Black coaches, T. Martin with Lamar Jackson, Ronald Curry with Josh Allen. Both of these guys are currently unemployed as we sit here. Now, maybe they catch on with some other teams that are, teams like the Raiders and whatnot that have openings and whatnot. The MVP runner-up this year, Drake May, coached by Ashton Grant, another Black quarterbacks coach, right? But you look at some of the previous, in comparison to some of the previous MVPs, Aaron Rodgers, right? His quarterback coach during his last 2 MVP seasons in Green Bay was Luke Getsy, immediately gets promoted to be an offensive coordinator in Chicago. Patrick Mahomes' first MVP season, his quarterback coach was Mike Kafka, right? Kafka, within a few years, was an offensive coordinator in the NFL with the Giants. Matt Ryan's quarterback coach during his MVP season, of course, was Matt LaFleur, right? Within 2 years of that, he was an OC. Within a year after that, he was a head coach in the NFL. And so you kind of see this disparity where Coach A, gets one of these cushy jobs that is a pipeline job, quarterbacks coach, tight ends coach, and they get kind of pushed within being an offensive coordinator, head coach within 3 to 5 years. And then you have Coach B, right, gets a similar job and just gets kind of stuck in that same role for the next 3 to 5 years. And, we are focusing primarily on the offensive side of the ball because that's where the majority of coaching head coaches come from. But, we can have a conversation about defensive coaches, right? I know the Athletic Football Show recently did have a conversation on their podcast last week about how, air quotes, underqualified white defensive coordinators like Jeff Hafley get jobs much more overqualified, air quotes, Black defensive coordinators. And Jeff Hafley may go on to be very successful in Miami. Time will ultimately tell on that. But he kind of got fast-tracked to being a head coach after 2 kind of middling seasons as defensive coordinator in Green Bay, compared to some Black defensive coordinators that have been kind of at the forefront of success on that side of the ball over the last, 4 or 5 years. Looking at Brian Flores and Patrick Graham and Vance Joseph and Anthony Weaver and Denard Wilson and Ejiro Evero. Like, Brian Flores, we know there are extraneous factors that lead to maybe Brian Flores not getting that opportunity, but Patrick Graham has done great work over the years with, making more out of less in New York and in Las Vegas. Vance Joseph, as we talked about at the beginning of this coaching cycle, has coordinated some of the best defenses in the NFL. Not getting a sniff, right? If you're looking for, Mike McDonald proteges, right? Jesse Minder gets that job in Baltimore, but what about Anthony Weaver? What about Denard Wilson? They were also part of that 23 staff in Baltimore that was so successful that led to so many other guys, going out in the league. And Ejiro Evero, he's a Vic Fangio protege. We know that the Fangio defenses have been du jour for the last 5 years, but Evero's just can't seem to go beyond being just a defensive coordinator in the NFL into being a head coach, despite, coordinating some very good defenses as well as some bad ones over the last, 5 or so years. So, those are guys that have been at the kind of the forefront. And again, we'll see what Jeff Hafley does. And obviously the Dolphins go out there and win 10 plus games for the next, 7 years. We'll be like, okay, well, yeah, maybe Jeff Hafley, was very qualified for that. But it's an interesting conversation. And obviously we're just skimming the surface of this conversation, but to me, it'll be interesting to sort of see where guys like Jordan Reid and DJ Williams and Kevin Koger are in 3 years. Have they been moving down the pipeline, or are they going to continue to be stuck in the current roles that we find themselves in? So this is something that is, to me, interesting to me. I'm sure it's interesting to some of you. I'm sure plenty of you do not care about this, and that's fine. That was going to end it for us here on today's episode. And tomorrow we'll talk more about probably quarterback options, right? People that could potentially be coached by Jordan Reid, and do a deeper dive on some of those options, as we promised earlier in the month on tomorrow's episode. So stay tuned for that here on Locked On Falcons. Check out Locked On NFL for the latest around the coaching musical chairs in the NFL. And of course, check out the Everydayer Club, which if you are an everydayer and you want to level up, your everydayerness, check it out. You get an ad-free version of Locked On Falcons, members-only Discord access, and so much more. Just head to lockedonfalcons.supercast.com for $5 a month or $50 a year. You can get more from, Locked On Falcons as an everydayer. So go check it out in the link in the description. It is all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.